Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be doing a better in-depth look into the F-14 radar. By popular demand, by meaning one person. So, what we're going to be looking at today is just a better overview into the radar, more advanced, going over more things to try and help everybody understand. So, the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to go over all the different buttons. Okay? The first thing we're going to start with is the WCS switch. This stands for Weapon Control System. So this is our computer, and this basically controls our radar. If we don't have this all the way up, our radar is silent and non-emitting. If we have it all the way down to the off position, our radar is completely off and takes about 45 seconds to boot up. So if we were to unpause, do that now, and flip it up, then we have targets appear on our display. Let's go and pause again. And the next thing we're going to look at are these four buttons right here. And the only buttons I want you to worry about is the first one, which is the TID. And the TID stands for Tactical Information Display. So TID is a top-down view of what your radar is looking at. Okay? And these bars right here control what your radar is scanning. And we'll go over that later. Now, if we were to click on the third button, let's go and do that. Then we have the feed from this is our raw output. So this little guy right here. So if we're looking at him, this is basically what our radar is seeing unfiltered, not in a top-down view. So what this means, or how we read this, is by closure rate, okay? So this bottom half means cold. So it means they're going away from us. This top half means we're closing. And the higher they are, the faster they're coming towards us. The lower they are, the more we're going away from each other. And this does not necessarily mean that we're pointed away from each other. It just means the closure rate is decreasing, so if they're down here, they're going away. They're up here, they're coming towards us. Okay, so now let's unpause and let's go back to our TID mode. So once again, we press this first button for our HCU to be able to control the bottom screen here, and we place the HCU the HCU radar mode to be able for the HCU to control this. Now let's do a quick demonstration of that. So if we click on the third button, we see our HCU controls what we're looking at. So we see the captain's bars. That's where our radar is looking. Now again, if we are to scan here, if you look down on the TID at the bottom, you can see where our radar is looking. So we're going to go back to TID mode. Okay, so now we're going to cover a couple more things. Next thing we're going to go into is the radar modes. Okay, so the basic mode is range while scan. So let's go and select that. So what range while scan does is it allows us to scan multiple targets and look at multiple targets at once. So it's helpful for when you have more than one target, which is 99% of the time. This allows us to get a picture of what we're looking at. And under RWS, there are two modes. There's track while scan auto and track while scan manual. 90% of the time you use track while scan auto. If it's going to be a long time before you learn to use track while scan manual, because that's assigning priorities to targets. And what track while scan auto does is it uses the computer in the F-14 to designate targets and priorities. So for example, if it finds out it's a bomber of any sort, it's going to obviously put that as a priority, because usually that bomber would be coming in to launch a missile against the fleet. And that's, a MiG-21 can't do that, so it's going to not designate that as a priority whenever there's a bomber in the area. And so whenever we do lock up targets, we'll explain TWS more. And what TWS stands for is track while scan. So we can fire up to, I think, 12, probably more targets, as many as we have. So if we have 6 missiles, we can fire at 6 targets. And it tracks them all separately. And the advantage of TWS is that the recipient, the target, never receives a launch notification until the missile is pitbull. And pitbull means active. and the missile goes pitbull and trackable scan within 10 miles once it gets within 10 miles of target. So the target only gets a launch notification until when the missile is within 10 nautical miles of the target. It'll get a lock warning, so it'll get a warning that we're locking them, but it won't get the warning that we've actually fired a missile at them. Okay, so now that we have those modes down, those are the main modes we're going to use. Okay, we'll worry about pull, stop, or track in a second, but since we're here, might as well go over them. So pull, stop, or track is just basically looking up one target. So all we're doing is instead of looking at multiple targets, we're just looking at one target. The advantage of this is we can get a longer range because we have better tracking information. The downside is that as soon as the missile comes off the rails, the target automatically gets a launch notification. So mainly we're going to be using TWS. So let's go ahead and go down here and we're going to look at the cap. It's basically it's our computer panel. It's our analog computer. Okay. And the three main things, go and unpause here, we got to worry about is this. Pause it again, is target data. And what target data is it allows us to look at a target and assign specific values, whether it's a friend, unknown, or hostile. All this we'll go over later. But the main things we're going to be wondering is friend, unknown, and hostile. So if it's a friend, we can lock up a target on the TID and mark it as a friend by clicking this button. Or we can lock up and mark it as unknown if we don't know what it is. Or we lock it up again and we know it's hostile, so we select hostile. And there will be different symbologies for different targets. If it is a friendly, it will have a half circle, and this will be displayed somewhere on the screen in Paint. It will have a half circle over the target. If it's unknown, it'll have a bracket. If it's hostile, it'll have a triangle. So the next thing we're going to go over is azimuth scan and elevation bars. So azimuth scan, we're going to go and unpause. Azimuth scan controls the angle at which our radar looks at. And so the advantages of this is the wider the scan, the more we're able to look at. The disadvantages, of course, the wider the scan, the longer the radar takes to refresh a target because it's traveling a longer distance. So if we're doing 65, it's going to take a lot longer time to scan 65 degrees than it is to scan 25 or 20. So with that being said, you usually use around 40 or maybe 65 to find out where a target is. Once you find out where it is, then you turn onto it and turn it down to 20 or 10 to get a quicker refresh rate on the target. The next thing is elevation bars. So elevation bars control what elevation we're scanning at. So if we're scanning at 1, it's basically anywhere around our co-altitude, somewhere close to it. Basically, like I think it's a 5,000 degree increment. If we're at 2, we're scanning 5,000 here, which would be our co-out, 5,000 above, or so it'd be 10,000 above us, up to 10,000 above us, and up to 10,000 below us. Then if we were to go 4, it keeps going. And of course, the advantages of this, like azimuth scan, is we can detect more targets, but the downside is that, again, it takes longer to refresh. So the next thing we're going to look at is the range. And if we cycle the range knob here, we have 25, 50, 100, 200, and 400. So we're going to go ahead and go over the quick symbology of the range. And the one we're going to go over is how to detect, how to see the range. So if every bar right here is 20 nautical miles. The space between them is 20 nautical miles. And the bar again is 20 nautical miles and so on. So we have 20, 40, 60, 70, or 80, and then 100. So if we were to change it to 50, we would have 20, 40, and then about half one, so it's about 50. So we're going to go back to, since these targets are within 50 miles, we're going to leave it like this because it gives us a better picture and better spacing between the targets. And the next thing we're going to look at is the TID display and the modes it's displayed in. So this is basically a top-down view with us at the bottom looking out, so we get to see who's in front of us. And with this mode, we get to see our velocity vector, so basically where the horizon is. Now if we go to AC, it just takes out the horizon. And if we go to the first mode, which I forget what it's called, it centers us. So we're in the center. This is helpful because if we have data link, we get information is passed between aircraft, and we kind of get a situational awareness page. So we can see people who aren't behind us because they're being picked up by either an AWACS radar or another friendly's radar, and it's transmitting from their aircraft to our aircraft and vice versa. But mainly, we're going to be using this. Okay, so that's about the basics of using the radar. There's not too much, trying to keep it simple. Don't fiddle with it too much, and as time goes on, you'll get more advanced and learn to use more certain modes to find more targets and how to defeat notches and all the fun stuff. And so the one thing I'll say is once you get used to the radar in the F-14, you appreciate the radars in the Gen 5 aircraft because instead of an entire cockpit dedicated to a radar, you have one screen. So, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and arm up. We're going to go ahead and arm up and get ready to fire at a target. So it's going to unpause. So we're up. So prep on. Go and select our Phoenix. Phoenix is selected. Change our display page to repeater. And let's go back to the Rio seat. So we're going to go to here is we're going to scan a larger azimuth to see if we can pick up the target. We're going to switch to Truckle Scan Auto. And this gives us the ability to see we have our Phoenix popped up. So we are going to try and pick up the target here. And they're very close to us. So we have our target locked up here. It's flashing, so that means we can fire. So we hold it down. Let's go and talk about it. So the new symbology we have is the now we only have 5 Phoenix missiles because we fired at it. It's solid. And so that means we just fired at it. And let's go and talk about the left. So the left means what the altitude is. And so the number 1 is 0 to 4,999. 2 is 5,000 to 15,000 or 14,999 and so forth. And so that means, and then to the right of it, we have the target time. So right here, it's 34 seconds. So in 34 seconds, the missile should impact our target. Let's go ahead and resume. So we have 29 seconds until impact. And with TWS Auto, the nice thing about TWS Auto is it'll use the required radar settings to keep a good lock on our targets. So we don't have to manually adjust our azimuth and elevation bars to keep a good track on the target. So now we can just stare into here and see what's going on. So it's going to change on display range. There we go. So in 10 seconds, when it gets to 10 seconds, we'll look at the missile. So to look at the missile, you press F6. Uh-oh, where is it? There we go. Boom. Okay, wow, we didn't even get to see the impact. So that's using TWS. And we have this target before it goes away. When it has an X through it, that means we lost track on it, and that's the last known location. And it'll go away after about 3 seconds. So now that's done, we're going to go ahead, take control of the cockpit seat, and we see the wreckage in front of us. And we're going to go ahead and circle back for another pass. Now usually we would just keep going and use sidewinders at short range, but for the purpose of this, we're just going to, I'll cut back to when we have a better range and we can lock the target. Now one thing we weren't able to show off was because we didn't have multiple targets displayed, was how we can use TWS. In TWS, if we had both targets displayed, we could fire both of them simultaneously while tracking both of them. So that's why TWS is nice, because you can fire at multiple targets at once. You don't have to lock up one target, fire. If I'm using pulse Doppler, which is only tracking one target, then that means I have to wait for that missile to impact the target before I can fire at another target. So that's when TWS really comes in handy, is when you can fire at multiple targets. So we'll go ahead and cut back whenever we're ready to re-engage. Okay, so we are back and we have picked the target back up in range while scan. And one other thing I would like to add is that in range roll search, the radar actually filters out ground clutter. And this has advantages because you don't just have all this unnecessary ground clutter, but it has disadvantages. This means um, whenever somebody notches you, which is basically going 90 degrees towards your aircraft, they disappear because the radar thinks as ground clutter and filters it out because it's not as strong of a return. And another blind spot is that if the target is going away from you, within 100 knots, it will disappear. So for example, if I'm going 350, a target within 450 and 250 will not appear on my radar if they're going away from me. So that is a pretty big blind spot, and that's when you kind of get to the advanced tactics of being a Rio and using all the different modes. But that's just something to think about. We won't really work on figuring that out for now. For now, we're going to work on locking up this target. Since we've detected range while scan, now I switch over to TWS Auto by clicking it. So now we gotta wait for it to pick him back up again. It's picked him back up. It's flashing. So now it's flashing. It's indicating that, what happened? It's indicating that we are ready to fire. And we can also tell because the launch button's slightly illuminated, so it means we have a clear launch. So we're going to hit him, or fire at him. And another thing to know in TWS is that you see on the right, this guy's number 1. And if we had multiple targets, it would go numbers 1 through however many targets were locked up in TWS. And what this does is it tells us what the priority is. So if it's number 1 and number 2, we're going to fire at number 1 first, and usually he's flashing. Whatever target is flashing is the one we're going to fire at. So if we resume, this guy is flashing, so we're going to fire at him. So we're going to go to the launch button, hold it. The missile's off, and we have 35 seconds to impact. And we see the smoke trail going off over there. Okay, so the last thing I'd like to talk about, but first we're going to watch the awesome missile shot once it gets within 20 seconds. And again, in TWS, it will automatically adjust the azimuth scan and keep a good track on the target regardless of any manual inputs you add in. And again, to lock the target, all I'd have to do is half trigger and then full action, or half action, full action. Okay, and we can tell that we have lost lock on this guy because it is an X through him, so that means we lost lock and that's his last known position. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and find the missile. And if we can see him off in the distance, he's kind of far. I don't know if you can see him or not. We'll see him here in a second. Here's the closer, here he comes. And he got vaporized. So that is the essence of the TWS. Hopefully that went into more detail. The last thing I'd like to go over is how to jettison the tanks. And so when I'm in the pilot seat, I have no way of jettisoning anything other than everything using my emergency jettison button. So it's your job as the Rio to jettison tanks prior to an air-to-air engagement. So how you jettison that is you go over here, and it's this left panel with all these switches. And it'll say tank jet. And you go over here, and they should be the same height, and you right-click it. Right-click both of them if we have both tanks. And what this does is it selects them, SEL. And so then if we go over to our jettison switch, it's in the safe position automatically. And to jettison them, all we do is we go over here, we do this quickly, and we go over to the switch and right click. So when we pause it, we can see the tanks and they are dropped. There they go. So that is one thing to do prior to an air-to-air engagement, because if we have the tanks, it's not impossible to win, but it certainly helps to not have a giant tank that's weighing you down, causing extra drag whenever you've taken all the fuel out. And so that's basically about it. So now we can go back and we can safe these switches. And another thing I just like to talk about quality of life as being a Rio is your job, since here in the pilot seat, I don't know if you noticed, but I do not have a I do not have a speed or altitude readout, so I have to manually cross-check. And in a dogfight, that gets pretty unnecessarily difficult. So the main role in a dogfight is to obviously keep track on the guy. But if I ask for speed, then you're going to go here and you're going to look at our speed. So outside the circle is our Mach. Inside the circle is our indicated airspeed. Unless we're under 200, at which under 200 Mach is no longer displayed, and this is airspeed. And this is altitude, of course, so at 1300, 400, and 13,440, 41, close enough. And just as another thing, the max turning speed is 400 knots, around there. So if we're getting to a turn fight, then I might ask for how close are we to turning speed. And you can go here and look at we're about 450. So you're going to say we're 50 knots too high. So then I'll pull a little more and reduce the throttle to get to 400. And once we get to 400 or close there, we'll say you're on turning speed. So just another thing is it's all about managing and helping and obviously keeping track on the guy in case I lose sight.